How's it going, everybody? I'm Seth Macy, filling in for Stella Chung, and this is the Weekly Fix, the show where we round up all the gaming and entertainment headlines you may have missed this week. The FTC's lawsuit against Microsoft over the Activision Blizzard acquisition is in full effect, and we've got some big news to share. Plus, speaking of which, the Bethesda Indiana Jones game will be an Xbox exclusive. Ha! Wow! Who could have seen that one coming? In the entertainment world, DC's The Flash is dropping hard at the box office, and two versions of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse are out there in the wild. New week, new scoops, it's newsin' time!
On the first day of Microsoft's court battle with the FTC over the $69 billion acquisition of Activision Blizzard, Microsoft has claimed Xbox has officially lost the console wars. A section of a document submitted by Microsoft describes its entry into the gaming industry in 2001, when its original Xbox was outsold by both Sony and Nintendo by a, quote, significant margin. And per Xbox, it hasn't stopped losing the console wars ever since. The document reads, Xbox's console has consistently ranked third of three, behind PlayStation and Nintendo in sales. In 2021, Xbox had a share of 16%, while Nintendo and PlayStation had shares of redacted and redacted respectively. Likewise, for console revenues and share of consoles currently in use by gamers, Xbox trails with 21%, while PlayStation and Nintendo have shares of redacted and redacted respectively. Microsoft goes on to argue that as a result, it is betting on a different strategy by generating profit through game sales rather than console sales and selling its consoles at a loss, quote, effectively subsidizing gamers' purchase of the hardware in hopes of making up the revenue through sales of games and accessories. Microsoft is arguing its status as the third-place gaming console makes the Activision Blizzard merger necessary to cement itself as a viable competitor with rivals Sony and Nintendo. This is only the first day of the trial. IGN will be covering it to its conclusion, including daily recaps and news from all the newly released documentation. Now to hear from the other side of the console war. Sony has said it won't share plans for the PlayStation 6 with Activision Blizzard if Microsoft's acquisition of the company goes through. As reported by Eurogamer, PlayStation CEO Jim Ryan told the FTC that it couldn't give immensely sensitive information about its next console to a company owned by Xbox. Ryan said Sony, quote, simply could not run the risk of a company that was owned by a direct competitor having access to that information. Now, while Sony won't publicly announce the PS6 for some time, it has discussions and shares hardware with developers well ahead of time so they can prepare games for the new system. This allows for the likes of Call of Duty to appear as a launch title, though Sony is suggesting here that the Microsoft deal going through could prevent this for its next console. It would also allow, Ryan said, for the likes of Call of Duty to be optimized for Xbox during this additional stint of development time. Xbox will presumably have to deal with the same issue when the new console generation comes along, of course, as Sony owns the likes of San Diego Studio and Bungie, who developed the MLB The Show and Destiny franchises respectively, both of which are multi-platform.
The ongoing antitrust trial involving Microsoft and Sony is the gift that keeps on giving, at least for all of us that get to roast hot dogs over this bonfire of insanity. A recently surfaced Microsoft email from 2019 shows the company believed they could, quote, spend Sony out of business. The email from Xbox Studios head Matt Booty to Xbox Chief Financial Officer Tim Stewart admitted Microsoft was in a, quote, very unique position to outspend their PlayStation competitor. Booty went on to write that in 10 years, Microsoft would look back and say it would have been worth it to spend $2 or $3 billion to stay ahead of Sony. The email is a peek behind closed doors at the massive publisher's business practices and the challenges it faces in the market. Booty also took shots at Google and Amazon, saying, quote, Amazon has shown no ability to execute on game content. Valid point. Google, on the other hand, is several years away from having a working game studio, according to Booty's observations. It is several years on from that email, and he is 2 for 2. Give him credit there. That email also shows that strong gaming content is something Booty believes sets Xbox apart, writing, quote, content is the one moat that we have, likely referring to Xbox's Game Pass service. The email subject line was GPARPU, presumably standing for Game Pass average revenue per unit. So why is this one email potentially so important? The FTC's lawsuit alleges that Microsoft's proposed acquisition of Activision Blizzard is anti-consumer choice. According to Lee Hepner, legal counsel at the anti-monopoly advocacy group American Liberties Project, Booty's terminology is monopolistic. Hepner said in a previous interview with IGN, quote, they want to build a moat around their console, which is antitrust slang for boxing out competitors. This is essentially the bulk of the FTC's case in one email. If the acquisition were to go through, Activision Blizzard content could presumably make its way to Game Pass, just like games from Bethesda, which Microsoft acquired in 2021. With only a few exceptions, all recent Bethesda games have been Xbox exclusive and available at no extra charge on Game Pass. The trial is set to continue through Thursday this week, and the judge is expected to make a decision in the next 2 weeks. Switching over to Nintendo news, and brace yourself because this one is a shock. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom sold a ton of copies, and not just digital downloads, real cartridges that you can hold in your hands and fuse to sticks to hit monsters with. According to Circana, formerly NPD, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom moved enough physical copies in May to make it the second best-selling game of the year, behind Hogwarts Legacy. In the same period, Zelda sold more than Resident Evil 4, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, MLB The Show 23, and literally every other game released so far this year. Pick one. It sold more than that. Nintendo already started patting themselves on the back not too long after the game was released, announcing they've sold 10 million copies in the first 3 days. The company also hasn't reported sales figures for the digital copies of the game, so the actual numbers are probably way, way higher, like as high as those islands in Tears of the Kingdom. Currently, the top 5 best-selling games of the year are Hogwarts Legacy, Zelda, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and Resident Evil 4.
It's no secret that developing a huge blockbuster AAA game is an expensive endeavor. But game developers and publishers haven't exactly been open to revealing their budgets to the public, unless they're in a major trial with the US government and details like a game's budget is part of the evidence being submitted. In partially redacted documents that have been included with Microsoft's ongoing trial against the Federal Trade Commission, Sony tried to hide from the public just how much it cost to make The Last of Us 2 and Horizon Forbidden West. And the magic numbers are $220 million and $212 million respectively. So how do we know those figures if Sony redacted those parts of the documents? Well, enhance!
Enhance 224 to 176.
It's possible that a paralegal at whatever law firm Sony has on retainer was tasked with redacting those numbers, but they did it with a pen that still let some of the original print underneath show through when the document was scanned. Zoom in close.
Enhance. Stop.
Yeah, get real close and you'll see it. It's a little tough to make out, but that's almost definitely $212 million for Horizon Forbidden West and $220 million for The Last of Us Part 2. Keep in mind that just like the movie business, this does not include marketing costs. So to actually make, market, and ship high-profile AAA games, it costs about as much as an Avengers movie. The document also lists how many full-time employees at peak headcount worked on the games, which, if we're deciphering the document correctly, looks to be about 300 employees for Horizon Forbidden West and 200 for The Last of Us Part 2. It kind of puts things into perspective when you consider huge indie hits like Stardew Valley that was made by one guy with the tiniest fraction of the budget the big guys get. Not saying it isn't worth it to spend the money and hire all that talent, it's just crazy to get a peek behind the curtain and see how different things are from game to game. Anyway, the trial will be continuing throughout the week, so stay tuned to IGN for the latest developments. In kinda sorta related news, Final Fantasy XVI sold a ton of copies. Congrats, Square Enix. Specifically, they sold more than 3 million in its first week. This includes physical and digital sales for the PS5 exclusive. There is one caveat though. According to GameIndustry.biz's Christopher Dring, UK sales for the physical copy of Final Fantasy XVI are 74% lower than those of Final Fantasy XV. But the game still managed to be the top video game sold during this week, so it's pretty obvious that digital sales are pulling most of the weight there. So, how are Final Fantasy XVI sales numbers related to the Microsoft trial? Well, Microsoft strongly considered buying Square Enix not too long ago. In yet another internal document now made public because of the FTC lawsuit against Microsoft, the company laid out its case as to why they should pursue an acquisition of the storied Japanese developer and publisher. The document from 2019 lists several reasons for the purchase, including bolstering Xbox's presence in Asia, where Xbox has struggled ever since the original Xbox days, and to gain access to Square Enix's library of games, including Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts. Xbox would hope that they might help bring people to Game Pass and the Xbox Series family of consoles. Another interesting tidbit, buying Square Enix might have boosted, quote, mobile segment growth for Xbox by providing, quote, future mobile exclusive Game Pass offerings. One of Game Pass's perks is that some of the games are available to play on mobile devices via cloud streaming, with progress being shared between mobile and console. We're not sure how far Microsoft got in these internal discussions about buying Square Enix, but maybe somewhere in the multiverse, those Final Fantasy XVI sales were bringing a little coin to Xbox.
The upcoming Indiana Jones game was originally set for a multi-platform release until Xbox's ZeniMax acquisition changed plans. Now, during today's trial between Xbox Activision and the Federal Trade Commission, Bethesda's Pete Hines revealed that Disney had an agreement with ZeniMax for a multi-platform AAA Indiana Jones game. After the Bethesda acquisition, the agreement with Disney was amended to transition the Indiana Jones game to an Xbox and PC exclusive. Now, Hines said the game is currently set to hit Game Pass on day one. Now, several emails and conversations shown during the trial added additional color to the decision to make Indiana Jones a platform exclusive. Now, Bethesda's Pete Hines said that he was told by Xbox head Phil Spencer that Bethesda should continue to look at title exclusivity on a case-by-case basis. Now, asked why Indiana Jones was ultimately amended, Pete Hines attributed it to, quote, reducing risk and trying to get a degree of clarity. He said, quote, you're dealing with a licensor who is giving a ton of feedback on what you're making, is going to add a ton of time to your scheduling. These agreements, you don't get to take as long as you want. You have a window of time in which you're going to release a game. You immediately have a clock that's ticking on you. Now, in short, while Bethesda has a degree of control over what happens with Starfield, it has much less control over Indiana Jones, which is owned by Lucasfilm. Now, Hines added, quote, truthfully, we also kind of like the idea of embracing bringing it to Game Pass and how many players we could get there. Now, first announced in 2021, the Indiana Jones game is coming from MachineGames, developer of Wolfenstein: The New Order and The New Colossus. Now, MachineGames is under the Bethesda ZeniMax umbrella, meaning it was included in Xbox's acquisition of the company. Now, the developers haven't officially announced platforms for the game, meaning Hines' comments today are the best indication so far of where players will be able to access Indiana Jones. Now, the game has been absent from Xbox's showcases since its announcement over 2 years ago. It's a long time. Bethesda's Todd Howard will serve as executive producer on the project, and Howard briefly mentioned the game in an interview last year, saying it would be a mashup of different genres.
Perfect Dark is one of my favorite games of all time, so I was super stoked when the reboot was announced back in 2020. But of course, nearly 3 years later, we're still waiting on the return of Joanna Dark, and it sounds like we still have years of waiting ahead of us. Now, this story is based on original reporting by IGN reporter Rebecca Valentine. At the time the teaser trailer for the Perfect Dark reboot was shown, which was created by an external CG house by the way, it was very obviously way far ahead of anywhere the game was at, according to one developer who was working at the initiative at the time. They added, we hadn't even figured out any of our core game mechanics, we didn't even really know what type of game we were making. Unfortunately, according to conversations with 13 sources familiar with the game's development, little meaningful progress has been made on Perfect Dark since that 2020 trailer. While a new partnership with Crystal Dynamics appears to finally be bearing fruit, multiple sources who have worked on the game recently say that Perfect Dark is still in the earliest stages of development, estimating that it's still roughly 2 to 3 years away from being ready for release. One former initiative developer told us, it was not that we didn't know what we wanted, it was that we kept making things that weren't what we wanted. We'd do it over and over again. The levels we had when I left weren't the same ones we'd had 3 months prior or 3 months prior to that. I don't know why people just kept hitting the reset button. That was definitely contributing to the feeling that we weren't making any progress, people kept starting over. In early 2021, Perfect Dark design director Drew Murray left the studio to return to his former employer, Insomniac. All our sources who were there at the time cited him as the first significant exit in what would become a veritable avalanche throughout 2021 that would nearly deplete the studio. A tally of those who list their work at the initiative on LinkedIn reveals 35 total departures in 2021 alone. The studio lost another 12 in the first 3 months of 2022, and LinkedIn numbers indicate the studio did not hire nearly as many new developers in the same period or even since. While these numbers are rough estimates, those who were there at the time suggest that roughly half the studio was gutted, with the total number of employees dipping down into the 30s at its lowest. Entire departments were hollowed out, and progress on Perfect Dark halted as people waited for key decision-making roles to be filled. One developer there at the time recalled literally doing almost nothing for 9 months. In 2022, nearly 4 years after the initiative was formed, Perfect Dark was essentially started over from scratch in Unreal 5. The studio had been working on Perfect Dark in some form since 2018, announced it in 2020, but in 2022 still didn't have much to show for itself. But today, Xbox's Matt Booty says the initiative and Crystal Dynamics have hit the rhythm on Perfect Dark, saying he had a full review of the game in May. It's still an FPS balancing combat and espionage with an emphasis on spy gadgets, some experimental movement tech, and a focus on narrative. Recent plans seem to be leaning towards some kind of episodic format, though the exact form and shape of it has yet to be determined and could still change entirely before release.
It's time to take a quick break. When we come back, Idris Elba talks about his James Bond aspirations, plus the Flash movie isn't doing so hot at the box office. See you in a flash! Welcome back. It's been discovered that 2 different versions of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse are being shown in theaters. But first, DC's The Flash movie is seeing significant drops in box office revenue. Let's find out some more.
In a surprise turn of events, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse swung back into the top spot at the box office this weekend. The Flash, meanwhile, had one of the biggest second weekend drop-offs in ticket sales ever. Despite this being its 4th weekend in theaters, Across the Spider-Verse is still clearly going strong, and this weekend's ticket sales put its global box office haul at $560 million worldwide. Pixar's Elemental took second place, which didn't have the strongest opening, but also only a 38% drop in ticket sales. The Flash, on the other hand, had a lackluster $55 million opening last weekend against its $200 million production budget. This weekend, it only pulled in $15.26 million in North America. That puts it around a 72% drop in ticket sales. For comparison, that's just slightly better than last year's Morbius. By our count, the only DC movie that had a worse drop was 1997's Shaq vehicle Steel, which saw a 78% decline week over week. I don't even remember that movie. DC's most recent outings have fared a little better than The Flash. Black Adam and Shazam! Fury of the Gods saw 59% and 69% drops respectively. And it's not exclusively a DC problem. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania ticket sales fell almost 70% after its opening weekend. That said, this doesn't bode particularly well for DC's next big summer release, Blue Beetle, which is slated to hit theaters August 18th. This would all seem like strong evidence of superhero fatigue among moviegoers, if not for the fact that Across the Spider-Verse is also a superhero movie. Maybe this indicates people would rather pay to rewatch a really good superhero movie than roll the dice on one that has had a mixed reception. Speaking of superhero movies, as we tend to do here, Logan director James Mangold has some strong feelings about the news that Hugh Jackman will be donning the iconic claws yet again for Deadpool 3. Speaking to Variety, the director lamented, "I can't say that there's a part of me that doesn't wish that we'd let it be. But there is always going to be another Wolverine. There could be a baby Wolverine and a cartoon Wolverine. As much liquid as they can squeeze out of that rag, they're going to try to. I don't measure my success on a movie like Logan with whether we ended the conversation, I ended my conversation." Deadpool's 3rd solo outing will undoubtedly be a lot more lighthearted and probably way more juvenile than Mangold's somber Academy Award-nominated swan song for the beloved X-Man, so we get it. That said, Mangold was speaking to Variety to promote Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, the 5th entry in a movie franchise that debuted 42 years ago, so it seems like that rag is having its share of liquid squeezed out of it too. With all due respect to Harrison Ford, maybe baby Indiana Jones or cartoon Indiana Jones are ideas worth exploring too. At some point, he's probably going to be recast.
Now, believe it or not, true believers, there's apparently 2 versions of the Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse movie being shown in theaters right now. There was a side-by-side scene done by Twitter user Bally Songs. Yeah, I think that's Bally Songs, yeah. Twitter user Bally Songs, which featured Spider-Man 2099 and Lila, where in one version she takes a selfie and another where she points at Miguel. Now, digging deeper into it, the Twitter user noticed the selfie shot was missing around the very same time Sony Pictures swapped out the original version due to the sound mixing issues many noticed were in the original's release. So it seems Sony Pictures didn't just go back to fix the sound, but it also slightly changed certain scenes. Now, at least one that we know of. But the spiderweb goes even deeper than this innocuous observation. The associate editor for Across the Spider-Verse, Andrew Leviton, came out and confirmed that there are multiple versions of the movie currently airing in theaters. Now, he came out and quote tweeted the original post saying, quote, "I was wondering when people might start noticing." Ooh. Now, there's no confirmation on how many different versions or cuts of Across the Spider-Verse are out there, but another user did notice the spot had slightly different dialogue in the hologram flashback scene. So with this bit of information, the question is, how many times do you plan on going to see Across the Spider-Verse in theaters? It's apparently like a box of chocolates, so you'll never know what you'll get every time you go. But the ultimate question is, why? why do we think those in charge decided to release different versions of the movie? Like, was it to play up the whole multiverse aspect? Multiple versions of the movie speaks to the variety of webheads showcased in the film. But honestly, I just don't know how many times I'll see it myself. I don't know if I'm gonna pay to see it again and again, just to see if I can notice subtle differences across the multiple versions out there in theaters. Now, this could just be Sony's way of trying to get us to throw more money at the movie. It's already made tons of dollars already. And now there's rumors we might not even see the sequel Beyond the Spider-Verse next year. In an interview conducted by Vulture, an experienced artist who has apparently worked on big budget animations for various studios claims there's no way Sony Pictures will hit its March 2024 release date. Quote, they've announced that Beyond the Spider-Verse will be released in March of next year. I've seen people say, oh, they probably worked on it at the same time. There's no way that movie's coming out then. There's been progress on the pre-production side of things, but as far as the production side goes, the only progress that's been made on the third one is any exploration or tests that were done before the movie was split into two parts. Everyone's been fully focused on Across the Spider-Verse and barely crossing the finish line. And now it's like, oh yeah, now we have to do the other one. Ooh, balls. Now that interview was apparently conducted in May, a month before the release of Across the Spider-Verse. Now the artist who spoke with Vulture remained anonymous for obvious reasons, so we'll have to take that with a grain of salt. But given the nature of the film industry, films constantly being delayed for a plethora of reasons, there could be some truth to it. But what do you think about this potential delay for Beyond the Spider-Verse? Like, the cliffhanger ending of Across the Spider-Verse didn't sit well with a lot of fans, and some folks even forgot that this was initially billed as a two-part movie. But let us know your thoughts down below. Now, moving on to DC news, the Flash movie apparently ripped audio from YouTube for one of its cameos. Now, while speaking with Screen Rant, the film's supervising sound editor dropped this bombshell as to where they lifted some of the audio. Quote, I'll tell you the truth, a lot of them were pulled from YouTube. We were finding those old clips, and then it was a matter of removing music if there was music tied to it, or just cleaning it up. Now, the Flash movie had a ton of cameos from various actors who portrayed DC superheroes throughout the years, some still with us and some sadly not. So it kind of makes sense that they'd use whatever resources to obtain audio for certain portions. But you'd think Warner Brothers would just have some sort of archive with whatever they're looking for somewhere lying about. I don't know. And ripped audio, I gotta mention this, ripped audio from YouTube isn't always top notch. But you know what, I guess they really wanted the audio to match the abysmal CGI showcased in the Flash movie. It looked really rough.
It's a bird, it's a plane, it's an official casting announcement for the next Superman movie. DC has officially announced that David Corenswet will portray the Man of Steel in James Gunn's upcoming movie reboot, Superman Legacy. And stop the presses, the Lois Lane to Corenswet's Clark Kent will be none other than Rachel Brosnahan. Corenswet recently appeared in Pearl and We Own This City, and Brosnahan is best known from House of Cards and her starring role in The Marvelous Miss Maisel, which is fantastic, marvelous, if you will. Gunn, who in addition to writing and directing the upcoming film is also the co-architect of the entire DC cinematic universe that's kicking off, confirmed the news on Twitter. Though we'll undoubtedly get some teasers, trailers, posters, and probably a bunch of leaked set photos before then, we can expect to see these two on the big screen July 11th, 2025. What's your take on this? Do you have strong feelings either way, or will you wait and give them the benefit of the doubt? Let us know in the comments. Friendly reminder that everyone thought that Heath Ledger would make a terrible Joker when he was first announced. Just throwing that out there. Never know. In other casting news, sort of, Idris Elba is not going to play James Bond. That shouldn't come as a surprise. However, the actor recently opened up in an interview about how the racist backlash to the possibility of him filling the role made the entire thought of it off-putting. Speaking to the Smartless podcast, he explained, essentially, it was a huge compliment that every corner of the world, except from some corners which we will not talk about, were really happy about the idea that I could be considered. Elba added, those that weren't happy about the idea made the whole thing disgusting and off-putting, because it became about race. It became about nonsense, and I got the brunt of it. Given the British actor's performances in shows like The Wire and Luther, not to mention his all-around charisma, it's not hard to imagine him playing the debonair spy. However, it ultimately seems like it was one of those pie-in-the-sky fan castings more than a real rumor, like Danny DeVito voicing Detective Pikachu or John Krasinski playing Mr. Fantastic. for more than just one scene. Whether Elba was ever an official consideration to play 007 remains unclear, but the series producer Barbara Broccoli, great last name, previously stated that it's time for a non-white James Bond. Unfortunately, a statement like that even needing to be made in the first place is partially what rubbed Elba the wrong way. Speaking to Esquire, he explained, "As humans, we are obsessed with race, and that obsession can really hinder people's aspirations, hinder people's growth. Racism should be a topic for discussion, sure. Racism is very real, but from my perspective, it's only as powerful as you allow it to be." Signing on to star in a franchise like James Bond is a significant investment for an actor's time, unless you're George Lazenby, I guess. And sadly, no matter how good a performance Elba were to give, much of the conversation around them would be about the color of his skin. So you can't blame the guy for focusing his efforts on roles that don't have as much baggage, like Luther, or say, Knuckles the Echidna. You can ironically chalk Idris Elba not being considered for the part of James Bond to an entirely different type of discrimination. The Bond producers are supposedly looking for someone younger to play the part in the next 007 movie, which of course opens up another whole can of worms about ageism in Hollywood that we're not going to get into.
I'm Seth Macy, filling in for Stella Chung, and that was your weekly fix. We will be back here next Saturday with more of the biggest gaming and entertainment news of the week, and we'll see you then.